Nasser will never die, chanted crowds of Arabs after the death of their leader in September 1970. For more than a decade, Gamal Abdel Nasser was the spokesman for every cause of the Arab peoples. From Cairo to Beirut, Damascus to Jerusalem, they felt orphaned and wept as much for Nasser as for their own fate during that period of disarray in the Arab world.
J'ai la nostalgie de cette période-là parce que on a vécu une période tellement belle d'espoir.
Nasser était dans ce temps-là, excusez-moi, le dieu du monde arabe. C'était le vrai dirigeant, le seul dirigeant, si vous voulez, du monde arabe.
On the streets of Cairo, several million Egyptians surrounded their hero's coffin. With Nasser, pride and dreams had also passed away. All that remained were illusions and cruel deceptions. For some, Nasser was the leader who had defied the Western powers. For others, he was the hero of Arab nationalism, for a long time a rampart against Islamism.
C'est un héros, c'est un homme qui a, à un moment donné dans l'histoire, été un phare pour le monde arabe.
لن تجد أفضل من عبد الناصر كقائد، ولكن نتيجة أو بسبب النظام الدكتاتوري أوصلنا إلى كوارث.
Nasser came to power in 1952 following a coup d'etat. He was the leader of a group of nationalist officers who ousted King Farouk, a corrupt monarch and heir of a dynasty first protected by the Ottoman Empire, then by the British Empire. The Free Officers Movement brought an end to several centuries of foreign domination and instituted a republic. These officers were unknown to the Egyptian public. Their standard bearer was General Mohammed Naguib, a popular and highly respected man.
Il va y avoir une lutte pour le pouvoir entre lui et Nasser, entre lui et les officiers libres en fait, entre autres pour savoir quel type de régime politique on va construire, et notamment si on va construire un régime multiparti ou bien un régime tel que Nasser le souhaite, c'est-à-dire un régime à parti unique.
Naguib wanted to establish a parliamentary democracy, but Nasser was against it. To counter his opponent's plans, Nasser strengthened his hold over the military. He encouraged the forming of new organizations for the youth and for women who gave him their allegiance. The confrontation between General Naguib, now president of the fledgling republic, and Colonel Nasser, his vice president, would continue until autumn 1954. On October the 19th, Nasser negotiated the withdrawal of the last British soldiers from the Suez Canal with the government in London. It earned him the reputation of being the guardian of Egyptian sovereignty. A few days after the signing of the agreement, Nasser chose Alexandria to deliver one of his lengthy speeches, the secret of which only he knew. Nasser began by reminding the crowd of the origins of his commitment to the freedom and dignity of the Egyptian people, when a man stepped out of the crowd and fired a gun at him. Gamal Abdel Nasser was unharmed. 8 bullets were fired, none of them hit him. On his return to Cairo, Nasser was greeted as a miraculous survivor, the protege of Allah, an untouchable. He became the hero of an Egypt in search of a leader, a Rais. From then on, Nasser stopped treating those who crossed his path with kid gloves. The Muslim Brotherhood was the largest and most structured opposition party. This religious, political and social movement which wanted to establish an Islamic government was an ally of Nasser before the coup d'etat. The perpetrator of the failed assassination attempt on Nasser, Mohammed Abdel Latif, was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was sentenced to death and executed. The lack of an independent inquiry left doubts about the circumstances of this attempted assassination, which still exist today.
Historically speaking, as someone who looks into history, I cannot find conclusive evidence as to what actually happened. According to Nasser, the Muslim Brotherhood, after thinking of the 52 coup as a coup that would create the kind of state they had in mind, felt betrayed by Nasser and decided to take a decisive action against him. The Brotherhood, of course, have a different narrative, which is that it was Nasser that originated or fabricated this assassination attempt in order to profit from it by detaining them.
Nasser had over 1,000 Muslim brothers arrested, including their leader. 6 of them would be executed. He proceeded with a cleansing of the Egyptian political class. He imprisoned all of his opponents that he could, communists and supporters of General Naguib, and sent them to detention camps. Accused of being behind the assassination attempt in Alexandria, Naguib was ousted and confined to house arrest.
Il agit en dictateur absolu. Il va rayer, gommer toute forme d'opposition et il va créer les premiers camps. Des camps, on n'oserait pas dire de concentration. Appelons ça des camps de prisonniers.
The problem when you have a leader who believes that he knows what's best for his country, and he believes that the advocates of any other views must be either traitors or public enemies, he would naturally believe that he needs a series of security organs, a long chain of security agencies, to keep all of these opponents in check, under surveillance or in detention camps.
As the absolute master of Egypt, Nasser set out to establish social justice throughout the land, his only declared political program. From a humble background, he had first-hand knowledge of the terrible poverty suffered by the peasants who made up the majority of the population. He confiscated land from the big landowners and redistributed it to the fellahs, the peasants of the Nile. He imposed reforms on his country that weren't always in line with Islam, like birth control and the prohibition of polygamy. But he didn't want to be seen as a communist or an atheist in the eyes of a deeply religious people. So he openly carried out religious duties and made several pilgrimages to Mecca. Nasser's main preoccupation was the development of his country until neighboring Israel attacked in February 1955. Following a series of Palestinian Fedayeen raids from the Gaza Strip, then under Egypt's control, reprisals by the Israeli army left dozens of Egyptians dead.
La doctrine en vogue à l'époque en Israël, c'est qu'on ne laisse rien sans riposte parce que la dissuasion d'Israël est à ce prix. Pourquoi? Parce que le pays est tout petit, parce qu'il est entouré d'ennemis. C'est pour ça qu'aux incursions de Fedayeen répondent des actions violentes.
Le facteur israélien, mais vraiment n'était pas très important dans la politique intérieure en Égypte. Mais lorsque les Israéliens ont attaqué Gaza, qui était sous le contrôle d'Égypte, il a trouvé qu'il serait très difficile pour un régime militaire d'accepter une telle défaite humiliante.
Nasser had hoped to avoid a conflict with Israel, but he had to prepare himself for the possibility of war and began to better equip his army. During the Bandung Conference in Indonesia for non-aligned countries, he sought the advice of Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai, who recommended he talk to the Soviets. During this Cold War period, Nasser knew the Middle East was in the United States' sphere of influence. So he first held talks with the Americans. In exchange for any help, they wanted him to sign the Baghdad Pact, a cooperation and defense agreement formed jointly by the United Kingdom, Iraq, Iran, Turkey and Pakistan.
Nasser refuse de signer ce pacte, puisque, rappelons-le, Nasser est un fervent défenseur du non-alignement, ni Est ni Ouest. Et on veut lui imposer ce pacte. Il ne veut pas le signer. On veut lui imposer ensuite de faire la paix avec Israël.
إن كان في اتفاق بين السفير البريطاني والسفير الأمريكي في مصر إن الأمريكان مش هيدوا مصر أسلحة إلا لو عملوا صلح مع إسرائيل.
Nasser refused to sign any peace agreement with Israel. He had no other choice than to turn to the Soviet Union. Moscow agreed with no conditions, as it was an opportunity to gain a foothold in the Middle East, until then the preserve of the West. So as not to anger the Americans, Egypt officially brought arms from Czechoslovakia, but the real supplier was the Soviet Union. Nasser could at last provide modern equipment to his army, at the head of which he appointed his loyal friend, Abdelhakim Amer, who thus held both positions of Chief of Staff and Minister of Defense. Nasser, the military man, wanted to give his regime a civilian appearance. In 1956, he had himself elected as president with almost 100% of the vote. To regulate the flooding of the Nile and form a reservoir to irrigate farmland which fed the vast majority of Egyptians, Nasser dreamt of a huge dam at Aswan.
L'Égypte a besoin d'eau. Le Nil ne suffit plus. En tout cas, pour irriguer, il faut un barrage. Et c'est vital. Il y va de la survie de ce pays. Il va donc, encore une fois, se tourner vers les Américains.
Il essayait d'avoir l'aide des Américains. Plusieurs pourparlers ont eu lieu pour qu'on puisse... Parce qu'il savait qu'il avait besoin du barrage d'Aswan. Il avait besoin d'argent pour l'économie et de lancer l'économie égyptienne. Les Américains l'ont dupé. Au début, ils lui ont fait croire que oui, on va vous aider.
L'Amérique a réfléchi, elle ne prêtera pas l'argent à l'Égypte. Donc cette humiliation-là, il l'a très mal vécue. L'Égypte est à l'agonie. D'où va venir l'argent? Canal de Suez. Donc c'est là qu'il pense au canal de Suez, quand toutes les portes ont été fermées. Quand il fait son discours, il raconte exactement pourquoi il le nationalise et comment on l'a humilié et comment il a frappé à la porte de l'Amérique et comment il a supplié l'Angleterre et qu'on l'a renvoyé comme un gueux, comme un moins que rien.
C'est la première fois dans l'histoire du monde arabe où un homme politique tape du pied et leur dit « Vous ne voulez pas m'aider? C'est pas grave, je peux me débrouiller ». Vous pouvez imaginer le reste du monde arabe quand il entend ce genre de discours. On est fiers, vraiment on était fiers en se disant au moins quelqu'un qui dit non. Maintenant ça suffit, on prend notre destin en main.
J'étais chez le responsable de notre parti. Il avait un radio, je crois, il était le seul dans le quartier qui avait un radio. Et nous étions chez lui, et comme nous étions contre Abdel Nasser, nous avons considéré Abdel Nasser comme un espion américain. Jamal Abdel Nasser a commencé à faire son discours. Nous avons continué à lui insulter, à lui accuser d'être agent et tout ça. Puis, quand il a dit décision du président de la République de nationaliser le canal de Suez, moi j'étais ému et les larmes sont vraiment bondies de mes yeux et couvert la radio de ma joie.
By nationalizing the Suez Canal, Nasser went from being a rais, a leader, to a zaim, a chief, traveling on the magic carpet of huge popularity throughout the Arab world. His defiance of the Western world was lauded by the majority of countries in the Third World. In the UK and France, the owners of the Suez Canal Company, the reaction towards Nasser was without nuance.
Si le dictateur égyptien remportait un succès à l'occasion du canal de Suez, ce serait une occasion pour un très grand nombre de pays arabes de lui emboîter le pas, de le suivre. Nous avons raison de dire non à Nasser. Et si nous avions dit non en 1936 à Hitler, nous n'aurions peut-être pas eu la guerre de 1939-1945.
The British and French press supported its political leaders as hysterically as the propaganda in the Egyptian press.
Ne vous y trompez pas, ce n'est pas une réincarnation, ce n'est qu'une mauvaise imitation.
Ils sont convaincus que que ce type, c'est un fou furieux. Écoutez, il faut se remettre dans l'esprit de cette époque coloniale. Comment un esclave se révolte contre son maître? C'était ça le choc. Ce qu'avait fait Nasser n'avait rien de particulièrement choquant. Il n'avait pas fait un hold-up. Il avait nationalisé un bien égyptien qui, au demeurant, serait retombé dans l'escarcelle égyptienne 10 ans plus tard. Il y avait un bail de 100 ans. Donc, en 68, le canal revenait à l'Égypte de toute façon. Deuxièmement, De Gaulle avait bien nationalisé les charbonnages de France. L'Angleterre avait nationalisé aussi. Ce n'était pas un acte absurde dans la mesure où il dédommageait les actionnaires.
For the British and French, it was a chance not to be missed to curb the rise of an enemy who was interfering with their interests in the Arab world. The UK was yet to accept its own departure from Egypt and also feared the expansion of Nasser's influence in the Gulf states where it still maintained a foothold. In the same year of 1956, France faced Algerian rebels who were supported by Egypt. Paris thought that by eliminating Nasser, it could bring an end to the war of decolonization. The French and British put together a secret plan with the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to attack Egypt.
L'intérêt d'Israël, c'était de briser la puissance militaire égyptienne dans le Sinaï. C'est l'époque où Nasser vient de signer un énorme contrat d'armement avec la Tchécoslovaquie, avec l'Union soviétique, avec le bloc de l'Est. Et Ben-Gurion a peur, véritablement peur, que l'Égypte devienne une puissance militaire avec laquelle il sera difficile de se mesurer une fois qu'elle aura digéré ces énormes quantités d'armement.
On October the 29th, 1956, troops under General Moshe Dayan crossed the Sinai heading for the Suez Canal, secretly backed up by French aviation. The Israelis met with little resistance from the Egyptian army. In line with the plan formulated before the operation, London and Paris sent an ultimatum to Egypt and Israel to withdraw from the canal. Nasser refused. The British and French were then able to officially join the conflict to stand between Egypt and Israel. On November the 5th, French paratroopers from Algeria landed near the canal. Then Royal Marine Commandos landed on the beaches and headed to Port Said. Both banks of the canal were occupied, and the three Allied armies were only 2 hours from Cairo. With his army facing defeat, Nasser sought to organize popular resistance. He addressed his people from the famous religious institution Al-Azhar to mobilize them.
هنقاتل زي ما قلت لكم امبارح لآخر نقطة دم. لن نسلم أبدا. إذا كانت بريطانيا بتعتبر إنها دولة كبرى وفرنسا بتعتبر إنها دولة كبرى، إحنا شعب مؤمن، هيكون شعارنا دائما الله أكبر.
بدأت أحس بأنه والدي يعني في الرئاسة وكده وقت عدوان 56، لأن لما ابتدى العدوان هو ابتدى فجأة، لأن والدي قال أنا مش هسيب القاهرة ولا أولادي هيسيبوا القاهرة، لأن وقتها في ناس راحوا في الأقاليم وفي الريف عشان يهربوا من الغارات.
The time of national crisis, he fell back on the very traditional way that Egyptians had been kind of mobilized before, the way the monarch before him would have, went, which is using the very traditional kind of religious discourse.
Nasser's religious-based call wasn't enough to prevent an Egyptian defeat. Popular resistance was insufficient and the army under Abdel Hakim Amer was crushed. Nasser was threatened. An ultimatum from the Soviet Union and the United States saved Egypt. The two superpowers forced the three Allied armies to withdraw. The Americans wanted to show that they were the masters in the Middle East, just as the Soviets were threatening an intervention in support of its only protégé in the region, Egypt.
La menace soviétique de lancer des missiles sur Londres et Paris n'était pas prise au sérieux, mais ce qui a été pris au sérieux, c'est la possibilité de la présence des troupes soviétiques dans le Moyen-Orient. Et je pense que les États-Unis ne voulaient pas cette perspective.
Les seuls qui ont un intérêt clair, et les seuls d'ailleurs qui vont gagner quelque chose, c'est Israël. Les autres vont revenir là contre les jambes, après avoir renforcé Nasser. Paradoxalement, l'homme a été formidable pour transformer des défaites militaires en victoires politiques.
As compensation for its withdrawal from the Sinai, Israel was granted authorization for its ships to take the Straits of Tiran in Egyptian waters and its only access to the Red Sea. UN troops would guarantee Egyptian compliance in maintaining freedom of navigation as well as guarding international borders by standing between the armies of Israel and Egypt. The Egyptian people weren't informed of the concession made to Israel. The withdrawal of France, Great Britain and Israel was presented to them as a victory due to Nasser's political nous. French and British nationals who had lived there for several decades were expelled from Egypt. The Jewish community present in the country for several centuries was accused of being Israel's fifth column. Thousands of Jews left Egypt for France, for the US and Israel, which welcomed almost half of them.
Vont être expulsés tous ceux qui ont des passeports français et britanniques, il va y avoir rupture des relations diplomatiques évidemment, et aussi toute une série de gens qui sont considérés comme des étrangers parce qu'ils n'ont pas de passeport. Et parmi eux, il y a beaucoup de juifs. Mais ce n'est pas l'expulsion de tous les juifs, mais ça va marquer le début d'une émigration juive qui va s'achever en gros au début des années 60.
الحقيقة أن مصر خسرت كثيراً خسرت على المستوى الثقافي وعلى المستوى الاقتصادي وعلى من هجرة الأجانب لأنه أولاً المعادلة المصرية اختلت في معادلة ثقافية مصرية اختلت هذه المعادلة هي أن كل من هو في مصر يعامل كالمصريين.
Egypt, which for centuries had integrated numerous cultural and religious diversities, changed under Nasser's impetus. The country's Arab identity was glorified. Nasser presented himself as the leader of Pan-Arabism, an ideology that advocated the union of all Arabs. He who promised the Arab peoples an end to past humiliations appeared as the heir to Saladin, the Arab Muslim hero, victor of the Christians during the Crusades.
Son discours parle au petit peuple. Les gens ont envie d'entendre ça. Ils ont rêvé d'entendre un homme qui leur dise « La nation arabe, le monde arabe va lever la tête, nous allons devenir une puissance ».
فكر عبد الناصر كان لابد أن يصنع هذه الأسطورة في العالم العربي لأنه كان يؤمن بأن العالم العربي كله واحد وبيؤمن بالوحدة العربية وبيؤمن بالقومية العربية وبالتالي هو يفتح المجال لأي مواطن في أي عالم عربي في أي بلد عربي لأن يعتبره زعيمه لأن هو لا يضع أو لا يعتبر نفسه زعيما مصريا هو يعتبر نفسه زعيما عربيا.
The Pan-Arab myth existed before Nasser. In Syria, the main proponent of this ideology was a Christian, Michel Aflaq, who called for a union of his country with Egypt. Political leaders in Damascus believed such a union would provide stability for their fledgling nation, whose borders had been traced by the former French and British colonialists. To them, Pan-Arabism would cement Syria's various religious and cultural communities.
It did make sense that Syria, very close to Egypt historically and culturally, and really the cradle of Arab nationalism as an ideology, would be the first state in that union. Nasser had the general idea that if the Arab world united, this would make them a strong bloc in international politics.
The union between Egypt and Syria was sealed in Cairo early in 1958 by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Shukri al-Quwatli, the Syrian president, to form a single nation, the United Arab Republic. The event caused euphoria among other Arab peoples who longed to join the union. In Damascus, a human tide greeted Nasser. Syrians came from every region of the country to welcome him. Arabs in neighboring countries joined the Syrians in saluting the hero of the great Arab nation.
أجمل استقبالات كانت لوالدي كانت من اللبنانيين الذين كانوا يعدوا الحدود ويروحوا دمشق ويستنوا يباتوا في الشارع لتاني يوم.
Plus de 300 000 Libanais qui ont fait le voyage de Beyrouth, enfin du Liban à Damas, pour acclamer cette union.
Les musulmans du Liban ont tout de suite voulu se jeter dans cette union-là et ont estimé que le Liban pouvait entrer aussi dans cette communauté.
The agitation of Lebanese Muslims caused fear among Maronite Christians who rejected close ties with the new United Arab Republic. Already weakened by an institutional crisis, Lebanon witnessed the outbreak of civil war. President Camille Chamoun asked the United States to intervene. American Marines landed in Beirut and occupied the country for several months, the time to dampen any hopes of joining the United Arab Republic. Meanwhile, Great Britain sent in paratroopers to protect King Hussein of Jordan, who feared a Nasser-inspired coup d'etat. He didn't want to suffer the same fate as his cousin, the King of Iraq, who had been assassinated by the Free Officers Movement. Calls by Nasser for a great Arab nation spread fear among the monarchies of the region. Saudi Arabia, a close ally of the US, was intent on curbing Nasser's growing influence.
C'était en vérité une bataille historique contre l'arabisme moderne et une idéologie, un gouvernement traditionnel, conservatif, islamiste.
Il y avait la guerre froide au niveau mondial, mais il y avait aussi la petite guerre froide dans le monde arabe entre les régimes soi-disant progressistes et les régimes soi-disant réactionnaires.
Nasser, the leader of the Arab world, was feted by people in all Arab countries and feared by their leaders. He exercised unmitigated power as leader of this new United Arab Republic. Just like he had done in Egypt, he banned all political parties in Syria, now known as the Northern Province. Nasser appointed his Minister of Defense, Abdel Hakim Amer, as his representative in the province, which was now under the authority of Cairo.
Il a fait une très grande faute en Syrie. Il n'a pas compris que la Syrie, c'est une société de la classe moyenne. Et c'est une société ouverte, c'est une société cultivée, c'est pas une société pauvre. Il a appliqué en Syrie les mêmes règles de politique qu'ils avaient appliquées en Égypte.
Ce n'est pas une union, ça va être de facto une annexion par l'Égypte de la Syrie avec une importation en Syrie des méthodes policières du régime nassérien, c'est-à-dire arrestation des opposants, torture, etc., et une sorte de pillage du pays qui va créer les conditions d'un coup d'État en 1961 de séparation entre la Syrie et l'Égypte.
The experimental United Arab Republic came to an end in late September 1961. A coup d'etat by the Syrian army returned power to the bourgeoisie, which had been ousted by Nasser 2 years previously. The Syrian crowds, which had greeted Nasser in 1958, now greeted their new leaders. The symbols of the former United Arab Republic were destroyed. Egyptians living in Syria were considered undesirable. Many of them were forced to flee to avoid reprisals from an ill-treated population. They flocked to Beirut before sailing for Egypt, taking the pan-Arab dream with them in their baggage.
فالقومية العربية هي في رأيي ليست مشروعا سياسيا. يعني هو المشكلة إنه تقديم القومية العربية على أنها قومية سياسية، إنه مشروع سياسي، لأنه في التاريخ المشروعات السياسية القائمة على قومية لابد أن تنتهي بالفاشية.
Face à l'échec, il va aller dans on peut dire une course en avant vers des mesures plus radicales, une deuxième phase de la réforme agraire, la nationalisation de l'industrie, de beaucoup de sociétés étrangères ou égyptiennes.
Cette folie de nationalisation à outrance, où il a donné aux gens 48 heures pour faire leurs valises, enfin ça a été une erreur colossale, mais colossale. Il a décapité entièrement l'intelligentsia égyptienne. Il a détruit un brassage culturel qui était la source vive de l'Égypte. Je crois que cette folie est née, parce qu'il n'y a pas d'autre mot, une folie paranoïaque, elle est née suite à la rupture avec la Syrie. Il a eu peur que les grandes familles égyptiennes ne tentent la même chose en Égypte qu'en Syrie.
The Syrian bourgeoisie having chased him out of Damascus, the traditional Egyptian bourgeoisie would pay the price. At the head of nationalized companies, Nasser placed military men who would soon form the dominant class, thanks to their income from widespread corruption. With an agricultural reform and the nationalization of all sectors, the economic model of Egypt resembled that of the Soviet bloc. The Soviet Union was Egypt's principal ally and supplier of various types of machinery and equipment. For Nasser, social justice meant Arab socialism, a socialism compatible with Islam.
Pour ne pas non plus sombrer totalement dans un esprit de socialisme athée qui refusait, il a parlé de socialisme arabe. Nous pouvons avoir nous-mêmes notre façon de voir les choses, notre façon d'imposer certaines conditions économiques et culturelles, tout en gardant aussi notre culture arabo-musulmane. L'islam ne quitte pas l'esprit de Nasser.
Nasser knew that the majority of the Egyptian people were attached to the traditional values of Islam. But society was also subject to other influences, that of the Soviet Union on a financial and cultural level, and that of the West, which attracted part of the urban youth. Nasser was caught between two stools. He encouraged a modern lifestyle due to his own beliefs, but in a calculated way also made concessions to traditional Islam. He authorized finance for the expansion of the Great Mosque, Al-Azhar, in return for its submission. The result? Al-Azhar lost all religious credibility in the eyes of the public. Egyptians began to turn to a stricter form of Islam as advocated by the Muslim Brotherhood, which continued to spread its ideas underground. Nasser sought to counter this growing influence, often mocking them in his speeches. In 1965, he told of a meeting, 12 years earlier, with the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood, who wanted to impose the veil on all Egyptian women.
قلت له يا أستاذ أنت ليك بنت في كلية الطب مش لابسة طرحة ولا حاجة ما لبستهاش طرحة ليه؟ إذا كنت أنت إذا كنت أنت مش قادر تلبس بنت واحدة اللي هي بنتك طرحة عايزنا ننزل ألبس 10 مليون طرح في البلد نفس
دخلت الجامعة سنة 62 63 لم تكن في الجامعة ولا بنت محجبة حتى البنات اللي كانوا بيجوا من الريف ما كانوش بيغطوا راسهم على الإطلاق كانت بلد مودرن كنا كلنا كده
Nasser's home movies resemble those of many families in the West. His wife and daughters were never veiled. And when he wasn't playing chess with his eldest son or a friend, he watched American movies in his home cinema. Nasser never hid his admiration for a certain kind of Western lifestyle.
Les jeunes égyptiens qui obtiennent des bonnes notes à leurs études universitaires étaient envoyés pour continuer leurs études supérieures aux États-Unis, en Grande-Bretagne, en France. Je pense qu'ils n'avaient aucun problème avec la culture occidentale.
Nasser a été rejeté vers le bloc de l'Est, et lui qui détestait les communistes. Il faut savoir que c'était un anticommuniste notoire. Et va se retrouver dans les bras des communistes.
Nasser's fate lay in the hands of the Soviets, who had halted the tripartite offensive of 1956 following the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Since then, the Soviet Union had become a major ally of Egypt. When the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev visited Egypt, Nasser welcomed him with open arms. For 2 weeks, he was greeted in triumph wherever he went. Egyptians were indebted to him for the construction of the Aswan Dam, inaugurated in great pomp. A dam that would improve the lives of millions of peasants in the Nile Valley. Khrushchev didn't approve of Nasser, who had imprisoned thousands of communists, but at the height of the Cold War, Egypt was the Soviet Union's only chance of gaining a foothold in the Middle East. Nasser's feelings towards Khrushchev were no warmer, but Soviet financial and military aid were vital to Egypt, especially at a time when the country found itself involved in a civil war in Yemen. A civil war into which two major Middle Eastern countries had been drawn, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt backed the Republican officers who had overturned the King of Yemen, who was supported by his Saudi neighbor. Nasser, who was seeking to establish himself as the leader of the Arab world, saw an opportunity to weaken Saudi Arabia, which was disputing his pan-Arab leadership.
Nasser believed that the Republican force was gaining momentum on its way to consolidate victory. He also believed that he would be required to send a few instructors, very minor military aid, to push them to the final victory.
Nasser avait considéré l'Arabie saoudite comme son contre-pôle. Et il a cru toujours, s'il va dépasser cet obstacle saoudien, le monde arabe va complètement tomber dans ses mains.
The monarchists proved to be stronger than he expected. The Saudis saw Yemen, which was directly on their borders, as a threat they could not live with. And they devoted substantial sums of money to hiring European mercenaries and other factions to support the monarchist camp.
Le Yémen va devenir très vite le Vietnam égyptien. Des milliers de mômes, des milliers de gosses vont partir faire la guerre là-bas. Et on peut vraiment comparer cela à la guerre du Vietnam. Ça a été là le début de la descente aux enfers de Nasser.
Egypt became embroiled in the civil war in Yemen, taking place some 2,000 kilometers away. The Egyptian army deployed massive means and sent elite troops to fight alongside Republican forces. In a Middle East coveted by the superpowers, Yemen had become a theater of the Cold War. The Soviets backed Egypt and the Yemenite Republicans, whereas the Royalists and Saudi Arabia were aided by the United States and the UK. The British military presence, still considerable in the region, would be directly threatened if such a war should spread to other emirates in the Gulf. This far-off civil war weighed heavily on the already fragile Egyptian economy.
Quand je quitte l'Égypte en 65, l'Égypte est à genoux. Il n'y a plus rien, on ne trouve plus rien dans le pays. Tous les aliments de première nécessité sont soumis à un rationnement. Donc c'est un pays ruiné. L'Égypte est un pays ruiné en 65.
Despite the economic difficulties in his own country, Nasser remained the leader of the Arab world, and the Arab peoples turned to him to find a solution to the Palestine issue. The Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, headed by Ahmed Shukeri, established itself in Cairo. In its heated meetings, calls were made for war on Israel. Shukeri stated that Jews who came on ships to settle in Palestine should leave on ships. Israel was involved in constant skirmishes with its neighbor. Attacks by Palestinian Fedayins were riposted with fierce reprisals. The diverting of the waters of the Jordan River by Israel created new tensions with three affected countries, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Once again, the Arab world looked to Nasser to counter Israel. To force him into action, the press of several Arab nations treated him as a coward and a puppet of the West.
La Jordanie, la Syrie, ces pays-là, et puis auxquels se sont joints d'autres voix arabes, ont dit à Nasser, mais enfin, comment tu laisses faire? Comment tu laisses bombarder? Comment tu laisses tuer des Palestiniens? Comment tu laisses tuer des Jordaniens? Tu es le champion de la cause palestinienne, le champion du monde arabe, tu ne peux pas rester les bras croisés. Et la pression était de plus en plus forte.
Se présentant comme leader du monde arabe, il doit offrir une solution à la question palestinienne. Il est pris par son propre discours, c'est vrai, et par sa rhétorique nationaliste arabe, de défense du monde arabe face à Israël, face à l'impérialisme.
Ce qui fait la différence entre un homme politique et un grand homme, c'est que le grand homme résiste à la pression. Il ne se laisse pas embarquer, comme s'est laissé embarquer Nasser.
Nasser consulted his friend, the Minister of Defense, Abdel Hakim Amer. He guaranteed victory should Egypt engage in war with Israel. Nasser then asked the United Nations to withdraw its troops, which stood between the Egyptian and Israeli armies on the border between the two countries. He also decided to ban access to the Straits of Tiran to Israeli vessels, thus reneging on the concession made to the Hebrew state in 1956. Abdel Hakim Amer, who needed to reboost his image after the bloody defeat at Suez, deployed his troops in the Sinai to impress the enemy.
Amer's never intended for the escalation to actually lead to war with Israel, but he thought that this show of force will intimidate Israel enough to present concessions.
Même s'il est probable que Nasser ne voulait pas lui-même faire la guerre, il a poussé Israël dans un coin de la seule possibilité, c'était de faire la guerre. Israël a fini par comprendre qu'il n'a pas le choix, il doit faire la guerre. C'est que nous ne savions pas, c'est à quel point l'armée égyptienne était mal préparée à cette guerre.
On June 5, 1967, at dawn, Israel attacked Egypt, but also Syria and Jordan. In a matter of hours, Arab aviation was destroyed on the ground before it had even taken off. Without air cover, the Egyptian troops deployed in the Sinai were annihilated. In 6 days, the armies of Egypt, Syria and Jordan were defeated. Israel had conquered all of historical Palestine, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. The defeat was both total and humiliating. Thousands of Egyptian soldiers, abandoned by their officers, were left wandering the Sinai desert. Meanwhile, Egyptian TV and radio were broadcasting claims of victory.
Les radios ont annoncé qu'on avait descendu 50 avions israéliens, que l'armée israélienne était en train de fuir, qu'on était à 200 mètres, à 200 kilomètres de Jérusalem, que tout était réglé. C'était des bulletins victorieux à toutes les heures.
J'étais à l'époque un étudiant à l'université et pendant la guerre, j'ai vu les troupes égyptiennes revenir du front. J'étais étonné. Et j'ai demandé à mes amis, mais qu'est-ce qu'on voit devant nous? Ils n'ont pas pu imaginer que c'était un retrait des troupes égyptiennes.
It wasn't until June the 9th that the Egyptian people learned of the defeat. When their great guide addressed them on TV, Egyptians were hoping to hear that a reversal of the situation would save their country. Having denounced a colonialist plot and accused the United States and Britain of aiding Israel, Nasser accepted responsibility for the defeat and announced his resignation. The Zaim, brave and strong in the eyes of his people, ended his speech fighting back tears.
Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
والدي رجع وكنا احنا مع مجموعة من قرايبنا قاعدين في البيت وابتدينا نسمع أصوات ناس 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 وفجأة لقينا هذا البيت اتملى حواليه كله ناس ويعني ابتدوا يغنوا أغاني وطنية باتوا بقى أفراد الشعب دول باتوا قضوا الليل حوالين البيت لتاني يوم الصبح.
Hundreds of thousands of Egyptians descended on Cairo in support of their race. For almost 48 hours, all over the country, there were the same scenes of anger and grief. Men and women of all ages pleaded with Nasser to go back on his decision. Despite the disastrous defeat, the people acclaimed him like no other leader had ever been acclaimed before. Nasser had managed to turn failure into triumph.
Nasser's admission of defeat in a very emotional address on national television was, whether he intended or not, a stroke of genius, because the image he presented was an embodiment of Egypt. Strong, optimistic, powerful, that was defeated by an overwhelmingly global conspiracy supported by the US, supported by many world powers, that did not wish to see Egypt strong once more.
L'Égypte se retrouvait avec une armée détruite, avec le Sinaï totalement occupé, avec le canal de Suez fermé. Il y avait une vraie crise dont tout le monde avait conscience et qu'il fallait, d'une manière ou d'une autre, arriver à résoudre. Et pour les Égyptiens, Nasser apparaît comme celui qui va pouvoir essayer de reconstruire ce qui a été détruit.
They saw that by sticking with Nasser, by allowing Nasser to raise his head up again, would be a symbolic act of defiance, saying that we have not been defeated. We are still standing.
Il y a eu des manifestations énormes dans Beyrouth en disant non, on ne veut pas, on refuse ta démission. Et pourtant, qu'est-ce que le Liban a à voir avec l'Égypte? Ce n'était pas son président.
J'ai manifesté pour qu'il reste. J'étais très, très heureux quand il a dit « Je vais rester pour quelque temps, jusqu'à on va effacer les traces de l'agression contre notre pays et le monde arabe. »
Nasser's return was announced by Anwar Sadat, the Speaker of the National Assembly. The next day, Nasser dismissed Abdelhakim Amer, held responsible for the defeat, and placed him under house arrest. A few weeks later, the government would announce his suicide. To maintain his power, Nasser embarked on a widespread purge of the army and the state apparatus. Pressurized by other Arab nations, he refused all peace treaties with Israel and launched a war of attrition. From then on, the object of confrontation with Israel was the recovery of the Sinai and no longer the Palestinian cause. The 1967 war worsened the fate of the Palestinians, who were forced into a new exodus. Tens of thousands of them crossed the Jordan River, swelling refugee camps set up in Jordan. The fate of the Palestinians gave rise to a feeling of humiliation throughout the Arab world. It was an opportunity for fundamental Islamists who saw the defeat of the Arab armies as divine punishment. They accused Arab leaders of having distanced their countries from Islam, the only true source of power.
هزيمة 67 أثرت وكانت من أسباب نمو الإسلام السياسي، بالإضافة لأنه الإسلام السياسي بطبيعته فاشية، لأنه هو لا يعترف أنه مثلك، هو مبعوث من ربنا، هو مبعوث من ربنا من الله حتى يقيم كلمة الله، فأنت إذا كنت ضده أصبحت ضد الله، وبالتالي هو من حقه أن يفعل بك ما يشاء.
And the Muslim Brothers, as the most prominent group within the Islamist camp, saw 67 as the vindication of their ideology, as a proof of the failure of Arab nationalism and Nasser's own leadership, and saw this as the time for them to come back.
Nasser's regime was discredited. The Islamist movement, developed underground before 1967, came out into the open. Weakened by his failures, Nasser was forced into making numerous concessions to conservative Islam backed by Saudi Arabia. Nasser, the leader of modern pan-Arabism, laid down his arms to the advocate of traditional pan-Islamism, King Faisal. Nasser needed Saudi petrodollars to rebuild his country. The adversaries of the past had become allies. They brought an end to the war in Yemen, which had opposed them since 1962. Together in Cairo, they also reconciled the new PLO president, Yasser Arafat, and King Hussein of Jordan, following a bloody clash between Palestinians and Jordanians in September 1970. It was Nasser's final political act that very night after the signature of the peace treaty. He died of a heart attack. At his funeral procession, millions of Egyptians followed his body through the streets of Cairo chanting, "There is no God but Allah, and Nasser is his beloved." He was buried in the Nasr Mosque, later named after him.
Nasser mort, il n'y a plus de dirigeant capable de s'adresser au monde arabe. Il n'y a plus eu, depuis Nasser, un seul dirigeant que le monde occidental aurait pu écouter.
Je pense que Nasser est une tragédie arabe, mais aussi israélienne. Et son échec, qui lui est largement imputable, son échec signifie l'échec du nationalisme pan-arabe laïque qui nous mène là où nous sommes.
يعني لو كان عبد الناصر عمل نظام ديمقراطي وعمل حزب وعمل ديمقراطية حقيقية كان هيكسب أيضا لأنه كان عنده شعبية قوية جدا. المشكلة في مصر أنه عبد الناصر الذي أسس مكنة القمع كان أكثر الحكام إخلاصا وشرفا ونزاهة وشجاعة. جاء حكام بعد ذلك فوجدوا مكنة القمع جاهزة للعمل.
Despite Nasser's death, the dictatorial regime continued. His old brother-in-arms, Anwar Sadat, gladly took on the role of dictator, backed by the police state established by Nasser. Sadat set about ridding Egypt of all trace of Nasserism, with the help of circumstantial allies, the Islamists, who once again had become the dominant political force. It was the end of the dream of a modern Egypt, symbolized for a short time by this peasant woman with one hand unveiled, the other resting on the Sphinx of eternal Egypt. Nasser's pan-Arabism was a distant memory. Throughout the Arab Muslim world, Islamism, in all its